So looking back at it now,
Yeah.
what could you, should you, or would you do differently in that particular moment? Like a concrete, like what would
Yeah.
you say differently?
Well, I could have just asked her more questions. What do you mean by blind faith?
Mm-hmm.
What was your religious upbringing like? Did you know hypocrites in your life?
Yeah.
There may have been hurt behind that question too. That I
Yeah.
could have asked her questions.
Mm-hmm.
I should have asked her questions and offered some of the reasons why actually Christianity is not a blind faith.
Well, welcome, friends, to the very first episode of Coulda, Shoulda, Woulda. This is a show where we talk about what we could have said, should have said, or would have said when we were having spiritual discussions, whether it was apologetics discussions or it was evangelistic discussions with people who don't always agree with us on everything, whether it's Christians, atheists, skeptics of every variety. What could we have said? What should we have said? And what would we have said if we had it to do all over again? Now, the point of this show is to encourage you, because I can't tell you how many times I've had conversations with folks where they say, boy, I was talking to my brother-in-law, or me and my sister were having a discussion, or a guy at work and I were really getting into it, and I wish you were there, or I wish I had, name your famous apologist, or your famous evangelist, or your best author that you can think of. I wish that person was there because they would answer this objection so well. The reality is, friends, the Lord has put you in their path. The Lord has put you in that conversation. So you don't need somebody else. You need you, and you need the Holy Spirit to guide you. So what we're trying to do with Coulda, Shoulda, Woulda is take people like me, people who do this regularly, often, whether on a stage or in personal conversation or through video, where we talk about spiritual matters. We engage in arguments all the time to encourage you by showing you that there are plenty of times when I look back on an engagement or I look back on a conversation and I think about what I coulda, shoulda, or would have said differently. The point is, all of us stumble. No matter how good we are at this, no matter how often we do this, all of us need to look back at our conversations, make a reassessment, because if you do that and you say, boy, I could have done that better, or this mistake I made, maybe I shouldn't have the conversations anymore at all. No, stay in the game. But the self-reflection allows you to think about what you coulda, shoulda, or would have done differently. And that allows you to actually go back and the next time be better. But above all, we ask for the Holy Spirit's guidance in these conversations. I've often prayed before I begin either a public address or even private conversations. Holy Spirit, I know I'm going to make mistakes in this conversation. I know I'll do some things wrong, but I'm confident that you will do neither. If you're with me, any mistakes I make, you will cover over. People don't come to faith because I was so convincing, but because you drew them. So with that confidence, we can move forward. So I do want to share with you a time when I coulda, shoulda, or would have done something different. And I'm going to have a guest on who's going to share their experience where they coulda, shoulda, or would have done something differently. So by way of context, I was doing a open forum at a church where we were inviting skeptics to come to it. And before we had actually had the conversation, before the event actually happened, some of the folks who were organizing it said, hey, there's going to be this guy who comes in. He's an atheist, and he's quite vocal. And he comes to the conversations that we have at our small group. It's based on apologetics. We go through the Bible, we go through various issues, and he's always got something to say. He's always got a sort of negative attitude about all the things. He's not really open-minded, and he's sort of condescending. This is what they said. I don't know this guy, so I don't know if any of that's true, but more than one person said it. So they said, he's going to come today. He's going to ask a question for sure when the Q&A starts, which I was actually looking forward to because I like that. I actually enjoy when people who don't agree with me and can be a little adversarial want to engage because it sharpens me, but it also allows me to, in my better moments, to actually exemplify Christ and be as compassionate and understanding as I possibly can be in those particular moments. Well, I was readying myself for this particular event, and when we got there were technical issues that were abounding, it seemed. The person who was running the tech at the church, even though we were doing a Christian outreach event, seemed a little bit less enthusiastic that he had been called to be a part of the event on a particular weekday night when he'd rather be doing something else, clearly. So I had already developed sort of an attitude about the whole thing. Well, during the course of my talk, there were more technical issues that kept creeping up, and that was sort of getting to me as well. Well, the Q&A starts. And sure enough, probably third or fourth question in, the guy pipes up, the guy who they said would be there, and he would say something that was going to be condescending and irritating. He asked a question. And it was a good question, by the way. The substance of the question was actually a really good question. Because I brought up science during the course of my talk, and he said, look, the problem is that Genesis actually gets the science wrong. In Genesis, on the third day, God creates plants and vegetation, but on the fourth day, he creates the sun. And of course, everyone knows, if you've studied science for even 10 minutes, that plants need to photosynthesize light from the sun in order to make food. And so plants couldn't possibly exist on the third day because the sun, which is a strong source of plant food, didn't exist until the fourth day. Genesis got the sequence backwards. So I began to answer him that essentially, when you look at the actual Hebrew grammar of Genesis, the Bible in the fourth day isn't describing that the sun and the moon were created on the fourth day. Rather, it's describing through the verbiage in the original Hebrew that the sun and the moon were visible from the earth on the fourth day. But the sun and the moon had already been created long before that, and that plants, in fact, on the third day could have been photosynthesizing photosynthesizing light from the sun for their food for quite some time before that. And by the way, this is irrespective of how long and how old the earth actually is, or how long the days actually in Genesis are meant to be. Well, he continued on, and he interrupted me a couple of times during the course of my answer and kept on saying things like, well, that's not what most people think, or you need to read more on this. And he gave me that sort of go educate yourself answer, which was, of course, it was in fact condescending. And my pride got the best of me. So I lashed out and I said, oh, really? I need to read more? Give me an author. Give me an example. Which books? That's a good question, actually. The problem is I didn't ask it with the right attitude at all. And that was off-putting. And then I began to say, sounds to me like you don't really want an answer. Sounds to me like you just want to have an argument and prove to everybody how smart you are. And that's what I said. And it was wrong for me to say it. And I was stewing, and I was seething. I was trying to put him in his place, not to point him to Christ. Well, I had a blessing in that particular moment because I had a colleague who was with me, and he took over during the Q&A session, and he began to answer the young guy, and did it with far more grace and compassion than I had at that particular moment. And this bothered me because I had taken quite a bit of pleasure and solace in the fact that I was pretty good under pressure. As a lawyer, you have to be good under pressure, and I was, typically. But this time, I lost my cool. And I don't know if it was all the circumstances that built up before that, and maybe you can relate. But regardless, it was inexcusable the way I handled him. But God was good to me in that particular moment, and good to him as well, because the young guy stayed afterwards. And for whatever reason, he still wanted to talk to me. And we got to share our views on this and wrestle with it a little bit more. And he saw what I was saying, and I saw where he was coming from as well. And though he didn't become a Christian that day, God gave me the second opportunity to rehash what I had done wrong, and how I would actually convey the truth in a much better way. So in the moments when my colleague was answering him, I was rehashing the blunder, the colossal blunder, frankly, I had just made, and how I coulda, woulda, or should have done something differently. And then God gave me the opportunity to say something differently. So I could have kept my composure. I could have asked him the exact same questions in a different way. I should have asked him, well, what would you recommend I read? Because I read quite a few things. What do you find wrong with the things that I've actually read? Or have you found some answers to this that maybe I'm not considering in the conversation? But then I could have responded with a little bit more conviction as well, because I was pretty sure that I was versed in this area. And looking back on it now, I know that if I get that preamble where there's going to be a difficult person or it's going to be a difficult situation, I would pray it through. When I'm going through those instances where it's going to be tough, where I'm already irritated and my attitude is pretty bad as it is, I'm going to recognize this is exactly how a conversation can derail, and an otherwise honest question might be turned into an argument where I quarrel instead of give a solid argument. So I could have done it differently, my attitude. I should have said something a little more gracious, and I will pray through it when I recognize that the circumstances are aligning against an actual fruitful conversation. So that's what I could have, should have, would have done in that particular instance. I think you can relate to that kind of a thing, and if you can, leave us a comment or write to us with the hashtag on social media, our socials, with Coulda, Shoulda, Woulda. COULDA, SHOULDA, WOULDA, Coulda, Shoulda, Woulda, and maybe we'll feature something or a story you have on the show as well. But with me today is my colleague and good friend Derek Caldwell. He's going to tell us a time when he coulda, shoulda, or would have done something differently as well. Welcome, Derek.
Yeah, thanks, Abdu. I can really relate to that story because C.S. Lewis has this great quote about you can tell how prideful you are by how angry you get when you see it in someone else and your reaction to it. Yeah. And very early in my faith, and I was very immature in my faith, so still I was doing this biology program in my undergrad, and I on my way to my BS in biology there, and
Bachelor of Science, by the way.
Bachelor of Science.
For there.
Thank you. Yeah. If I try to talk about biology today, it might be the other. But so I was doing undergraduate research in a lab looking at zebrafish as a model for a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and it was really interesting research. But next to our lab was the genetics lab, and there was the lab tech there. She was nice, but you got the impression sometimes she really thought she was the smartest person in the room. Mm-hmm. And I know that irked me early on. And anyway, one time we're having a conversation outside, having lunch, because it's always better to eat your lunch outside of the lab than in the lab. And she mentioned something about how she used to go to church, but now she's a scientist and she doesn't believe in blind faith anymore. Now,
good opportunity, right?
Yeah, good opportunity. Great opportunity. I don't even know if she was aware that I was really a Christian. I mean, maybe she did. Sometimes I wore this cross necklace. I had the witness wear type of stuff going on. A blood donor saved my life sweatshirt and that kind of stuff. But the interesting thing is, when she said that, I took it very personally. And so instead of offering any sort of positive evidence, all I said was, well, actually, you still use blind faith. Almost like, yeah, well, I use it, well, so do you. Mm-hmm. I said, well, because every experiment you do, surely you have to know the reagents won't mess with your results, and someone before you had to do experiments to make sure the reagents you're using, the chemicals you're using, the things you're using to hold, the auger plates, whatever. Mm-hmm. You have to make sure that's not going to mess with your results. Now, are you redoing all of the experiments they did, or are you just trusting that they did it right? Are you even reading those results, or do you just assume those things? Mm-hmm. Have you looked into it at all? Because if not, that's blind faith. And I did catch her, and she got red, and she just told me, yes, I have done all that. I've repeated every experiment to make sure our experiments, which I knew was not true. Yeah. But I could tell she was then on the defensive and felt very accused. And what I noticed afterwards as I thought about it was, I wasn't trying to defend the Christian faith. I wasn't defending Jesus. I wasn't defending the Bible. I wasn't defending faith in general. I was defending myself. So I was an apologist for me, trying to defend the type of beliefs I had by attacking her and showing her she had the same thing without ever questioning the premise of religious faith always being blind faith. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Mm-hmm. I never offered her any reasons for, why is the faith I have not blind faith? And boy, what a great testimony that would have been as someone who's in this science program. And typically there's this idea of this divide between faith and science. And yet here I am, someone who can bridge those, bridge science and faith together, and I have no issues with it. I think that was, I felt something within me rise, and I lashed out, and I didn't care about her as a person in those moments, really.
So looking back at it now, what could you, should you, or would you do differently in that particular moment? Like a concrete, like what would
Yeah.
you say differently?
Well, I could have just asked her more questions. What do you mean by blind faith?
Mm-hmm.
What was your religious upbringing like? Did you know hypocrites in your life?
Yeah.
There may have been hurt behind that question too. That I
Yeah.
could have asked her questions.
Mm-hmm.
I should have asked her questions and offered some of the reasons why actually Christianity is not a blind faith. There's lots of evidence. There's lots of reasons from logic, from just rational thought, but also evidential things, empirical evidence that as scientists we appreciate those things,
Yeah.
obviously. And then I would have, and I will in the future try to take myself out of the equation and stop worrying about how I'm perceived and stop worrying about being the smartest person in the room or being brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
All I care about is giving someone an accurate depiction of Jesus now and not being seen as, they'll only believe what I say about Jesus if they know I'm a genius. And the thing is, I'm not a genius, so it was already a losing game to begin with. So those are the things I would have done. And just pray, because I'm not there to win an argument. I'm there to show Christ's love to someone. And that's, if I'm not doing that, then I've missed it. And that took, for anyone out there watching and thinking, oh, I've made that mistake too. It does take time to figure that out and to mature in your faith, but you'll get there, and the Holy Spirit will help you get there.
That's right. And friends, the important thing to remember is that we're not actually given only one shot. Now, there's times when you won't ever see a person again, maybe on a plane or something like that, and you engage in this kind of a thing where your attitude is more at issue than it is the actual substance of your questions, because your questions were actually quite good. So the question is, what was the introduction of those things and that kind of thing? Yeah. Friends, we always get time redeemed. Maybe there'll be a Christian who comes alongside that person in the future, and God can use your mistakes even to plant a seed or orient someone's mind for the next person's encounter. So don't beat yourself up too much, but take the time, as we would suggest, to think about what you could have, should have, or would have done differently. And the good news is God will give you an opportunity where you can, you shall, and you will do something differently if you think it through. So it's for His glory, not ours, that we engage in these endeavors. We thank you so much for joining us. Thanks, Derek, for sharing with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.